Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, folks. Michael Zuber, one rental at a time, back with my friend and guest from Thursdays, Mr. Jonathan Twomley. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you, Michael?
Awesome. One of the things I'm doing this week with all my experts is I'm rewinding the clock a little bit to the day that Lehman Brothers collapsed. And this is going to be probably pretty interesting for you because you're actually in New York, right? In the hub of the activity. I was watching it from the Silicon Valley, and it was scary for me. So I can't imagine what it is for you. And the reason I wanted to talk about this, I don't know if you saw the news, but there is a large property developer in China. I forget the name at the moment.
Evergrande or something.
Evergrande, yes, Evergrande or something like that. 300 billion. Yeah, 300 billion in US denominated debt, can't make interest payments, stocks crashing 80%. And I'm like, oh my God, this feels like Lehman Brothers, right? And I'm like, I got to go back and look at it because it was a series of dominoes, but they fell so fast. So, Jonathan, what were you doing back when Lehman Brothers went under and all of that?
So I was a corporate attorney in New York City at the time. And, uh, it's trying to, I mean, this is now 13, 14 years ago. Was it 2007?
Seven, I believe. Yeah. 7 or 8. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember watching that happen in slow motion, where the Bush administration called all the people together and said, what are we going to do? And they had just bailed out Bear Stearns, was it? They just bailed out somebody else, I'd forgotten. And then they were like, well, we can't keep on bailing everybody out because it'll send the wrong message to the market. And they let Lehman collapse. And it was just like a shockwave hit New York. Everybody, I mean, if you are a professional in New York, people working on Wall Street. I had a lot of friends working on Wall Street, and obviously the firm I worked for had a lot of business on Wall Street, and it was just like, I guess, it sounds, you can't really compare these things when I compare them anyway, at the risk of saying something crass or inappropriate, but it was a similar kind of moment to 9/11, right? Like when it was just like, holy, like what just happened. And 9/11 was still a really recent memory for everyone in New York. So it was just like adding, that on top, like we just suffered through this horrible tragedy, this physical, terrorism act. And now we've got the major bank collapsing. What is going to happen? So that was what was sort of going through my mind and other people's minds. But there was just a big sense of like panic as to what is this going to lead to? Because this is, as you remember, it wasn't like Lehman collapsed out of the blue. Like this was kind of like there was a lot of lead up to this, right? There were things started going bad. You had other financial institutions that were getting hit with all of the collapsing, property prices and worthless, debt obligations that they held that they thought were, couldn't possibly be ever made worthless, and then suddenly they were. Yeah. So you saw this sort of like rolling, this disaster unfolding almost in slow motion until Lehman collapsed, and then it went into fast. Like, what's that saying, like things collapse slowly and then all at once? Like that's exactly what happened.
That's what I remember as well. There was kind of a buildup. And it's kind of felt, again, I'm an outsider. I'm in California. I'm in the tech industry, right? We had teams that called on Wall Street, but I was second or third derivative away from it. But what it felt like to me is, right, the dominoes were falling for a little while and you could see them, but people were jumping in to kind of brace them and try to stop it. And then the next domino would fall anyway. And then when Lehman Brothers fell and nobody stopped it and it hit the ground, i.e. crashed, and you see people taking boxes out of the office, then everything, it's just rapid fire, boom, boom, countrywide, IndyMac, was it Wachovia or Washington Mutual? I mean, they're just like bing, 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 bing. I was like, Oh my
And
God, what is happening?
I remember, and I might have the chronology mixed up in my head, but my memory is that like AIG went down before Lehman and Merrill Lynch went down before Lehman. But in both cases, they had, with Merrill Lynch, Barclays stepped in and bought it. With AIG, the government bailed it out. But you were seeing these things happen. And then my recollection is that when Lehman came up,
Mm-hmm.
The Bush administration was like, should we rescue this or not? Because if we keep on bailing everybody out, we send we basically create a moral hazard in the market. And like the shareholders are really the ones who should be taking it on, not the taxpayers. So my recollection is they let it go. Maybe they couldn't find somebody to take it over, but I thought there was also partly like we have to let this go because otherwise it's gonna can't bail everybody out. And so everyone was sort of watching that happen in slow motion and even watching what was going on with Lehman, like, are they going to rescue it? Are they not? And then Paulson, I think it was him made the announcement, that they were letting it go. And then it was just like the panic hit the streets. And
then we had crazy things like there was a money market account that broke the buck. You remember that?
Yep.
Right. Which never supposed to happen, but it did. And it was really weird.
If you want to talk about the aftermath too, I mean, so
sure,
I was a lawyer. I was doing litigation, right? So normally when the economy goes bad, litigation heats up. I mean, there's always litigation going on all the time, but it can be a little bit counter-cyclical because what happens is when there's a crash, people start looking for, someone to blame, right? Someone they can collect from. So having been through the dot-com crash, where the dot-com crash led to a lot of litigation and a lot of litigation like in the real estate industry too, right? Because everything was connected, people's stock portfolios went kablooey and then they couldn't pay their mortgages. And then, so on commercial, the economy went bad and commercial loans went bad. So there was a lot of litigation that came out of that. So we basically, when Lehman, after we kind of like caught our breath after Lehman collapsed, we're like, all right, here it comes. We get, braced for the wave of new litigation business coming in. And then it didn't. And it was like it was very weird because we were expecting this big wave of like finger pointing and stuff. And I think what happened was the financial crisis was so bad that people didn't even want to risk spending money on litigation that they might, that they might not win or they might not be able to collect or whatever. And so that's how bad it was. Like it was not just like a recession, like 2001 where the economy got soft and some people went out of business. I mean, even though there was a big crash, like the effect on the economy in 2001 wasn't as great, but 2007, 8, I mean, that was like the wheels of the economy just ground to a halt.
Yeah. Do you were an attorney at this point, not really in the real estate sector, but do you remember what happened in New York real estate? Because in my market of Fresno, I had luckily sold all my houses in 1031 into apartments. So what happened in Fresno is once that happened, that was kind of the shock wave. And then the lenders went kablooey and nobody can get a loan. My market had 4 years of kind of like every month was a lower price, right? It was like a death by 1,000 cuts. And my market was one of the hottest. The house that I sold first ultimately was worth 300 at the peak, ultimately retraded again at 75. So, 70% fall. What did you see in New York if you were paying attention?
Well, I was, because I was in the process of buying this, mansion that I live in right now. our 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. But we were in the process of buying this apartment, and my wife was pregnant and with our first child, and we had been renting an apartment, and she was like, you must buy an apartment or a house before I have this baby. She was like, I'm not having this baby in this rental apartment that we're living in. And I was like, honey, the market is tanking. We just have to wait. Like, and because you could see it, right? And we'd been looking for literally, we'd been looking for an apartment for a while. And when we started, the open houses were packed. And actually the crash was delayed in New York, right? So
Okay.
it took, even though the Lehman collapse and everything, I guess that was what started it in New York, but the crash had actually started happening before that elsewhere, right? Where the peak was
Yeah,
like
for sure.
the peak was 2000, late 2007, even into 2008 in New York City. So it took a while for it to roll through here. Um, and I just remember like just begging my wife, like, please wait. But she was like, no, I'm not waiting. So we actually saw this apartment twice. We had taken a look at it. Someone else bought it. Then they couldn't. They got rejected by the co-op board.
Oh,
which like never ever happens in this building. But they basically put in like a fraudulent application, so the co-op board bounced them. Came back on the market, and then when we saw it again, it had a big price reduction on it. So we bought it. So we did save some money. We didn't buy it quite at the peak, but then as things kept on going, like within a few months after we closed on this, there was, this is a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment. There was a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment that got sold for like almost $100,000 less than what we paid for this.
Ouch.
And I was like, see, honey, we could have just waited 6 months, So, and then there were definitely, I remember a lot of things for sale in the neighborhood. Like literally, if we'd waited just a little while, we could have bought a house in the neighborhood, rather than an apartment. Like and we had even thought of like, should we sell this place at a loss just to free up cash? Because we had a very small mortgage, just to get cash so that we could go buy a house. We thought about it. I wish we had done it. We would have done really well had we done that. But we just didn't want. We just moved. We didn't want to go through moving and renovating and everything all over again. So we just stuck it out. But the market definitely tanked, and it was probably a good. I don't think that we were sort of back to the price we paid for this place for 3-4 years, but it wasn't that long. It bounced back pretty quickly because this is New York, right?
Yeah,
so
that's very interesting because again, I talked about Fresno falling 4 years to the bottom. That house that I sold at 264 that peaked at 300, just this year got back to 300. So what is that? 13 years? It's a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it just goes to show you what, if you have a market like with limited supply, right? Yeah, it's really limited, a lot of wealth, and that's things bounce back pretty quickly in that circumstance. Then we went into like the building boom in New York City after that, but it was all aimed at flight capital. Like they weren't building any. They weren't building any. Well, they built a lot of rentals, right? Because the whole thing was like, oh, nobody can buy anymore. They only want to rent, which I don't know. You know how developers are. It's like fighting the last war. So they built a ton of rentals, and then there were super luxury condos. So like nothing under $5 million, and it was all aimed at basically Russian and Chinese money. So, and then of course when they cut off the Russian money, all that stuff started tanking. 4 or 5 years ago, and the Chinese started imposing some currency controls too, right? Yeah. So a lot of those developers, really sucked wind because they couldn't sell all they built was super luxury.
Yeah,
and then nobody bought it. Yeah, so
the reason I wanted to go back to this again is China may be, again, the Chinese market is pretty opaque. From the outsiders aren't going to understand it. You never know what the Chinese government's going to do. They could come in and stop it immediately. But, one of the things that the Lehman moment taught us was counterparty risk, right? One company going out by themselves, no big deal, but it's all the other companies that were attached to it. And you just don't know, right? This $300 billion in loans, who else could be in trouble if this company goes out? So this is why I wanted to relive the moment, because the other crazy thing that I'm thinking about that I want to get your opinion on is if the Chinese property market starts to suffer because it is pretty inflated, could that actually cause a rush to the dollar and ultimately lower rates? Could it be that big of a rush, you think?
I don't. Let's kind of like think about this. I haven't thought about the Chinese property market for a long time. I used to spend time thinking about it and trying to figure out what it all meant and how it was going to impact us. But then I sort of, after a while, just gave up thinking about it. But, you know, the Chinese market is interesting because they've built millions of condos that people bought that nobody lives in. Nobody is ever going to live in. It's sort of like Bitcoin, except and you don't just see cash. It's all based on appreciation, and appreciation is based. Well, I don't understand the property market in China at all, right? But there's definitely like a potential house of cards thing here, whereas if there stopped being like there's no secondary market for those apartments that people bought, right?
Right.
Then what happens, right? Then everybody basically, their net worth is all now severely impaired because they now own these worthless apartments. And I think that's one reason why the Chinese government has juiced the property market for such a long time, and it has to continue juicing the property market. So how does that happen? If all those, so the